Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her tactical vest one final time as the helicopter descended toward the extraction point. The desert wind whipped through the open door, carrying sand that stung her face despite her protective eyewear. Around her, 12 Navy SEALs checked their weapons and gear with practiced efficiency. None of them spoke to her directly. She had earned the nickname Falcon during her first week with SEAL Team 6, though not for the reasons most people assumed. The men thought it was because of her sharp eyes or quick reflexes. They had no idea about the real story behind the name, and Sarah preferred to keep it that way. Some secrets were better left buried, especially in a world where respect was earned through blood, sweat, and proving yourself when everything went sideways. The team leader, Commander Jake Morrison, glanced at his watch and raised his hand. 5 minutes to insertion, he announced over the comm system. His voice carried the authority of someone who had led countless missions in hostile territory. Morrison had initially opposed having Sarah assigned to his team, but higher-ups had insisted. A congressional mandate required female integration into special operations units, and Sarah Chun had somehow made it through the grueling selection process. What Morrison and his men didn't know was that Sarah had grown up in the mountains of Colorado, where her grandfather had taught her skills that most people only saw in movies. Her grandfather, a former Army Ranger who had served in Vietnam, had recognized something special in his granddaughter when she was just 8 years old. While other children played video games, Sarah learned to track deer through fresh snow and identify the sound of different aircraft engines from miles away. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. The SEALs moved with choreographed precision, establishing a perimeter while Sarah gathered her specialized equipment. Her role on this mission was officially listed as intelligence support, but everyone knew she was there because of political pressure. The target was a compound in the Afghan mountains where high-value terrorists were believed to be planning attacks against American interests. As the team moved through the rocky terrain under cover of darkness, Sarah noticed things the others missed. The way certain rocks had been disturbed, fresh tire tracks that were only hours old, the absence of night, sounds that should have been present in this environment. Her grandfather had taught her that nature always told a story, and tonight the story was warning her that something was very wrong. Petty Officer First Class Tony Rodriguez, the team's point man, held up his fist to signal halt. Through hand signals, he communicated that he had spotted movement ahead. Morrison studied the terrain through night vision goggles and made the decision to continue with the planned approach. Sarah wanted to speak up about her observations, but she knew that questioning the team leader would only reinforce their belief that she didn't belong there. The compound appeared exactly as described in their intelligence briefings. A cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall, with 2 guards visible at the main entrance. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was the complete absence of any other signs of life. No cooking fires, no sounds of conversation or movement from inside the buildings. No animals, which should have been present in any legitimate village or safe house. Morrison divided the team into 3 groups. Alpha Team would take the main entrance. Bravo Team would cover the rear exit. Charlie Team, consisting of Morrison, Rodriguez, and Sarah, would breach the largest building where the targets were supposedly located. Sarah's job was to secure any intelligence materials while the SEALs handled the tactical aspects of the operation. As they approached the target building, Sarah's unease grew stronger. Her grandfather had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that they were walking into a trap. The guards at the main entrance had been too easily visible. The compound's layout was too convenient. The intelligence that had led them here felt too clean, too perfect. The breach went exactly as planned, which was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. The door gave way easily under the explosive charges. The hallways were clear of resistance. The rooms they cleared were empty except for scattered papers and abandoned equipment. Everything was proceeding too smoothly for a facility that was supposed to house experienced terrorists. In the main room, they found exactly what they expected to find: maps of American military installations, communications equipment, documents in Arabic that appeared to detail plans for attacks on civilian targets. Morrison ordered Sarah to photograph everything while his team secured the perimeter. Rodriguez took position at the window, scanning the surrounding area for threats. Sarah began documenting the intelligence materials, but something about them felt wrong. The papers were too clean. The ink was too fresh. The handwriting looked practiced rather than natural. Her grandfather had taught her to pay attention to details that others overlooked, and these details were telling her that someone had prepared this scene specifically for them to find. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm system. "Commander, we've got vehicles approaching fast. Multiple contacts from the east and south." Morrison immediately ordered the team to prepare for extraction, but Sarah realized they were already too late. The sound of engines was coming from all directions, and the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors was growing louder by the second. The attack began with a rocket-propelled grenade that struck the building's eastern wall. The explosion knocked Rodriguez to the ground and filled the room with smoke and debris. Morrison grabbed his rifle and returned fire through the window while shouting orders to his scattered team. Sarah dove behind an overturned table and tried to process what was happening. This wasn't a random encounter with enemy forces. This was a carefully planned ambush. Someone had known exactly when and where they would be. The intelligence that had brought them here had been deliberately planted to lure them into this trap. Sarah realized that their mission had been compromised from the beginning, and now they were fighting for their lives in a situation that was rapidly spinning out of control. Automatic gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the compound. The other SEAL teams reported heavy resistance and multiple casualties. Morrison's calm voice over the radio contrasted sharply with the chaos erupting around them. "All teams, this is Charlie Leader. We are taking heavy fire and request immediate extraction." "Say again, we need extraction now." The response from their command center was not encouraging. "Charlie Leader, be advised that extraction is not possible at this time. Enemy air assets have been detected in your vicinity. You are ordered to evade and move to alternate extraction point Bravo. Confirm receipt." Morrison exchanged glances with Rodriguez, who was bleeding from a head wound but still functional. Moving to extraction point Bravo meant traveling 15 miles through hostile territory with enemy forces actively hunting them. Without air support or reinforcements, their chances of survival were slim at best. Sarah checked her gear and made sure her communications equipment was secure. The intelligence materials they had found were obviously fake, but her real mission was about to begin. The SEALs had no idea that her presence on this operation wasn't just about political correctness or military integration. There were aspects of her background and training that she had never shared with anyone in the military, and now those secrets might be the only thing that could keep them alive. Another explosion rocked the building, this one closer than the last. Through the smoke and dust, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving between the buildings with tactical precision. These weren't random insurgents or local militia. They moved like professional soldiers who had been specifically trained and equipped for this operation. Morrison made the decision to move out before they became completely surrounded. "We're leaving now," he announced. "Rodriguez, you're still point. Chun, stay between us and watch our six. We move fast and quiet until we clear the compound, then we run like hell." As they prepared to leave the building, Sarah took one last look at the fake intelligence materials scattered across the floor. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to set up this ambush, and they had used her team as bait. The question was whether they knew about her special skills, or if they were about to get a very unpleasant surprise. The night was about to become much more dangerous for everyone involved. The three SEALs moved through the compound like shadows, using the smoke and darkness to mask their escape. Sarah followed Rodriguez's lead, her boots finding purchase on the rocky ground without making a sound. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing closer. Voices shouted in multiple languages, and the beam of flashlights cut through the darkness as enemy forces searched for them. Morrison pressed against a stone wall and held up his hand for silence. Through the night air, they could hear the other SEAL teams engaging enemy forces on the opposite side of the compound. Gunfire echoed off the surrounding mountains, punctuated by the occasional explosion. Radio chatter indicated that Alpha Team was pinned down and Bravo Team had taken casualties. Rodriguez pointed toward a gap in the compound's outer wall where they could slip through undetected. Morrison nodded and signaled for Sarah to follow. As they moved toward their escape route, a figure emerged from behind a pile of rubble 30 meters away. The enemy fighter raised his weapon, but Sarah was already in motion. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but it changed everything the SEALs thought they knew about their female teammate. Sarah's hand moved to her belt and came back with what looked like a small throwing knife. Her arm snapped forward in a motion so fluid it seemed choreographed. The blade struck the enemy fighter in the throat before he could fire a shot or raise an alarm. Morrison and Rodriguez stared in shock as Sarah calmly retrieved her weapon and wiped it clean on the dead man's clothing. She moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before, many times. Her grandfather hadn't just taught her to track deer in the Colorado mountains. He had taught her skills that dated back to his time with a special operations unit that officially didn't exist. Where the hell did you learn to do that? Rodriguez whispered as they continued toward the wall. Sarah looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed much older and more experienced than her military record suggested. My grandfather taught me a few things, she replied simply. We should keep moving. They slipped through the gap in the wall and found themselves in open terrain. The nearest cover was a cluster of rocks about 200 meters away, but reaching it meant crossing ground where they would be completely exposed. Morrison studied the route through his night vision equipment and counted at least 6 enemy positions between them and safety. Behind them, shouts indicated that someone had discovered the body of the man Sarah had killed. Within minutes, search teams would be combing the area around the compound. Their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Morrison made the decision to run for the rocks and hoped they could reach cover before being spotted. They had covered about 50 meters when the first shots rang out. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions as enemy fighters opened fire. Morrison and Rodriguez dove for whatever cover they could find while bullets whistled overhead. Sarah, instead of seeking protection, did something that defied all military training and common sense. She stood up and began moving toward the enemy positions. Rodriguez shouted for her to get down, but Sarah ignored him. Her hand went to a pouch on her tactical vest and came out with 3 small objects that glinted in the moonlight. Her arm moved in rapid succession, and 3 enemy muzzle flashes went dark in quick succession. The sound of men crying out in pain and surprise echoed across the valley. Morrison couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sarah was moving through the darkness like a predator, using terrain features to mask her approach while systematically eliminating threats. Every movement was precise and calculated. She wasn't just lucky or well-trained. She was operating on a completely different level than anyone he had ever served with. The remaining enemy fighters began to panic as their comrades fell silent one by one. They fired randomly into the darkness, unable to locate their attacker. Sarah used their confusion to close the distance, moving from shadow to shadow with an expertise that spoke of years of specialized training. Rodriguez managed to reach Morrison's position, and together they watched Sarah single-handedly neutralize an entire squad of enemy fighters. "Boss," Rodriguez whispered, "I don't think she's really just intelligence support." Morrison nodded grimly. "I'm starting to get that impression." When the shooting stopped, Sarah appeared out of the darkness as silently as she had vanished. Her clothing was torn, and she had a cut on her forehead, but she moved with the same fluid confidence. "Area's clear," she reported matter-of-factly. "We should reach the rally point before they send reinforcements." Morrison stared at her for a long moment. "Chen, what's your real story? And don't tell me your grandfather taught you to throw knives like that in Colorado." Sarah met his gaze steadily. My grandfather was Captain James Chun, 5th Special Forces Group. He spent 3 years in Laos doing things that never officially happened. After he retired, he made sure I learned everything he knew. The pieces began falling into place in Morrison's mind. The ease with which Sarah had passed the SEAL training program. Her uncanny ability to read terrain and spot threats. The way she moved through dangerous situations without apparent fear. She hadn't been assigned to his team because of political pressure. She had been assigned because someone higher up the chain of command knew exactly what she was capable of. They began moving toward the rally point, covering ground quickly but carefully. Sarah took point, leading them through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in darkness. She seemed to know exactly where to step to avoid loose rocks and which routes would provide the best cover from observation. As they walked, Rodriguez couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. So what's the story with the nickname Falcon? I'm guessing it's not because of your eyesight. Sarah was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she spoke without looking back at them. When I was 12, my grandfather took me hunting in the mountains. We were tracking an elk when we ran into 3 men who had gotten lost in a snowstorm. They'd been without food for 2 days and were starting to show signs of hypothermia. The weather was getting worse, and we were 8 miles from the nearest road. She paused to check their route before continuing. My grandfather sent me ahead to mark a trail while he stayed with the men. I moved through that terrain faster than anyone thought possible, marking trees and finding the safest path back to civilization. When the rescue team finally reached them, one of the men said I had moved through the forest like a hunting falcon, appearing and disappearing without warning. Morrison realized there was more to the story than she was telling them. That doesn't explain how you learned to fight like that. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face them both. In the moonlight, her expression was serious and slightly sad. My grandfather wasn't just Special Forces. He was part of a program called Project Blackbird. They trained soldiers to operate alone behind enemy lines for extended periods. No support, no backup, no extraction unless the mission was completed. The program was officially terminated in 1975, but my grandfather kept training. She resumed walking, her voice becoming quieter. He taught me everything. Survival skills, weapons training, hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, interrogation techniques. By the time I turned 18, I could do things that most special operations soldiers never learn. But he made me promise never to use those skills unless lives were at stake. Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. So you've been holding back during training? Sarah nodded. I couldn't show my real abilities without raising questions I couldn't answer. Tonight was the first time I've used everything he taught me. They reached the rally point to find chaos. Alpha Team had suffered 3 casualties, and Bravo Team was missing entirely. The extraction helicopter had been shot down, and enemy forces were converging on their position from multiple directions. Morrison's team was now the only functional unit remaining from the original 12-man squad. The senior surviving SEAL, Master Chief Petty Officer David Park, briefed them on the situation. We're looking at a 15-mile hike to the secondary extraction point through terrain that's crawling with hostiles. We've got wounded men who can't move fast, limited ammunition, and no air support. Morrison looked at Sarah, who had been studying a tactical map while listening to the briefing. Chen, what do you think? Sarah traced a route with her finger that avoided the obvious paths, but would require traveling through some of the most difficult terrain in the region. We can't fight our way out, she said quietly. There are too many of them, and they know the area better than we do. But if we're willing to take some risks, I can get us out without engaging enemy forces directly. Park looked skeptical. What kind of risks? Sarah pointed to a section of the map that showed a deep ravine cutting through the mountains. This gorge runs almost directly to our extraction point, but it's considered impassable. The walls are nearly vertical, and there's a river at the bottom. In daylight, with proper equipment, it would be extremely dangerous. At night, with wounded men, most people would consider it suicide. Morrison studied the terrain features on the map. But you don't think it's suicide? Sarah shook her head. I think it's our best chance. The enemy won't expect us to go that route because they think it's impossible. If we move carefully and use the techniques my grandfather taught me, we can make it. Park wasn't convinced. Even if we could somehow get down into that gorge, how do we get back out on the other side? Sarah pointed to a spot where the topographic lines indicated a possible climbing route. There's a game trail here that leads up to the ridge. Animals use it to reach water, which means it's passable if you know what you're looking for. The debate was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Enemy forces had tracked them to the rally point faster than expected. Morrison made the decision that would determine whether they lived or died. We go with Chen's plan. Whatever happens, it's better than sitting here waiting to be overrun. As they gathered their wounded and prepared to move out, Sarah made sure her specialized equipment was secure. The SEALs were about to discover why her grandfather had spent so many years teaching her skills that went far beyond normal military training. The most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. The edge of the ravine looked like a gateway to hell. In the pale moonlight, the walls dropped away into darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. The sound of rushing water echoed from somewhere far below, indicating a river that could either save them or kill them, depending on how they handled the descent. Sarah knelt at the edge and began unpacking equipment that none of the SEALs had seen before. Climbing gear that looked military grade, but wasn't standard issue. Ropes that seemed lighter and stronger than anything they carried. Devices for anchoring that could be set quietly and removed without leaving traces. Master Chief Park watched her work with growing amazement. "Where did you get this equipment?" Sarah looked up from her preparations. "My grandfather had contacts who supplied certain types of gear to people who needed it. This stuff has been tested in situations a lot worse than this." The wounded SEALs were conscious but couldn't climb under their own power. Sarah rigged a pulley system that would allow them to lower the injured men safely while maintaining enough control to stop or adjust their descent if necessary. Every knot she tied and every anchor she set spoke of experience gained through years of practice. Morrison helped her test the rope systems while Rodriguez kept watch for enemy forces. The sound of vehicles was getting closer, and they could see searchlights beginning to sweep the area around their previous position. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the enemy reached their current location. "How deep is this gorge?" Park asked as Sarah prepared to make the first descent. She had volunteered to go down alone to secure the bottom and establish a safe landing area. "About 200 feet to the water level. The river's running fast, but it's not too deep this time of year. The current will carry us downstream about half a mile before we can safely get out." Rodriguez shook his head. "You're talking about rappelling 200 feet in the dark, then swimming half a mile down a mountain river with wounded men. That's not a plan, that's a prayer." Sarah finished checking her harness and looked at him with the same calm expression she'd worn all night. "My grandfather used to say that the difference between a prayer and a plan was preparation. I've been preparing for something like this my whole life." She clipped her descent device to the rope and tested it one final time. "Give me 10 minutes to reach the bottom and secure the area. Then start sending down the wounded men one at a time." Morrison grabbed her arm before she could begin her descent. "Chun, if this doesn't work." Sarah met his eyes, and for the first time that night, she smiled. "It's going to work, Commander. Trust me." She disappeared over the edge of the cliff like a spider going down a web. The SEALs could hear the soft whisper of rope through her descent device, but no other sound. Within minutes, her voice crackled over the radio. "Bottom secured. Water's cold, but manageable. Send down the first casualty." Lowering the wounded men required precise coordination and steady nerves. Each SEAL had to be secured in a special harness that would keep him stable during the descent while allowing Sarah to guide him to safety at the bottom. The process took longer than Morrison would have liked, but there was no room for error. They had just started lowering the second wounded man when enemy forces reached the top of the ravine. Flashlight beams swept along the edge as soldiers searched for any sign of the missing SEALs. Morrison pressed himself against a boulder and held his breath as voices spoke in a language he didn't recognize. The rope continued to play out slowly as Sarah guided their teammate to the bottom of the gorge. Any sudden movement or sound would give away their position and trap them between enemy forces above and the deadly drop below. Rodriguez drew his sidearm and prepared to fight, but Morrison signaled him to wait. One of the enemy soldiers walked directly to the spot where they had anchored the rappelling system. He knelt down and examined the ground carefully, then called to his companions. Morrison couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably one of discovery. The soldier reached for his radio to report their findings just as Sarah's voice whispered over their comm system. Second casualty secure. Ready for number 3. Morrison made a split-second decision that saved all their lives. He rolled away from the anchor point and opened fire on the enemy soldiers. His burst caught the man with the radio in the chest and sent him tumbling over the edge of the cliff. The other soldiers immediately returned fire, but Morrison and Rodriguez had already moved to new positions among the rocks. "Go now," Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "Get down that rope while we keep them busy." Park didn't hesitate. He clipped onto the line and started his descent, moving as fast as safety would allow. Rodriguez provided covering fire, while Morrison prepared to follow. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them as more enemy forces arrived at the cliff edge. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from at least 8 different positions. They were heavily outnumbered and would be overrun within minutes. He made the decision that separated truly exceptional soldiers from merely good ones. "Rodriguez, get down there now." "That's an order." Rodriguez started to protest, but Morrison cut him off. "Someone needs to slow them down, or they'll just follow us down. I'm the logical choice." Before Rodriguez could argue, Morrison pushed him toward the rope and turned back to face the enemy. Sarah's voice came over the radio with an urgency they hadn't heard before. "Commander, what's your status? I can hear gunfire up there." Morrison keyed his mic while changing magazines. "Taking heavy fire. Rodriguez is coming down now. I'll follow when I can." What Morrison didn't tell her was that he had no intention of following. Someone needed to make a last stand to give the others time to escape, and as team leader, that responsibility fell to him. He had made peace with that decision when Sarah's voice stopped him cold. "Commander, move to the anchor point in 30 seconds and be ready to rappel. Don't ask questions, just do it." Before Morrison could respond, the night exploded into chaos. Sarah had climbed back up the cliff face in complete darkness, moving with a speed and silence that defied belief. She emerged behind the enemy positions like a vengeful spirit, striking with lethal precision before anyone knew she was there. Knives flew through the darkness with deadly accuracy while she moved from target to target. The enemy soldiers, trained professionals who had been confident in their superior numbers, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against an opponent who seemed to appear and disappear at will. Panic set in as their comrades fell silently around them. Within minutes, 8 armed men had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing into the night. Morrison reached the anchor point to find Sarah calmly coiling rope and gathering equipment. Her tactical vest was torn and she had blood on her hands, but her movements remained steady and controlled. "Ready to go, Commander?" she asked as if she had just completed a routine training exercise. The descent to the bottom of the gorge passed in a blur of controlled falls and careful maneuvering. Morrison found himself rappelling faster than he would normally attempt, but Sarah's voice guided him through every step. When his feet touched solid ground, he realized he was shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Rodriguez helped him out of his harness while Park tended to the wounded SEALs. Everyone was accounted for and, miraculously, still alive. Sarah was already scouting the river and planning their next move. The water was running fast and cold, but it was their highway to safety. "The current will carry us downstream to a spot where we can climb out," she explained as she distributed waterproof bags for their equipment. "Stay together and don't fight the water. Let it do the work and save your energy for getting out." They entered the river in a line, with Sarah in the lead and Morrison bringing up the rear. The water was shockingly cold, and the current stronger than expected, but Sarah had chosen their entry point perfectly. Within minutes, they were being swept downstream toward their extraction point. The swim lasted longer than any of them expected. The river twisted through the mountains like a living thing, carrying them past sheer rock walls and through rapids that would have been impossible to navigate under normal circumstances. But Sarah seemed to know every turn and obstacle, guiding them around the worst hazards with hand signals and quiet words of encouragement. When they finally reached the extraction point, dawn was breaking over the mountains. The secondary landing zone was exactly where it was supposed to be, and the sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance. They had made it against odds that any reasonable person would have considered impossible. As they waited for pickup, Morrison sat beside Sarah on a boulder overlooking the valley. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "How long have you really been doing this kind of work?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. "This was my first official mission with Special Operations," she said. "But my grandfather started training me when I was 8 years old. He said that someday I might need these skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." She looked at the SEALs they had brought safely through the night. "I guess he was right." Morrison nodded slowly. "What happens now? Word about tonight is going to get around. People are going to want to know how one woman managed to do what you did." Sarah smiled and stood up as the extraction helicopters appeared on the horizon. "Now you know why they call me Falcon," she said. "And maybe your team will stop thinking of me as just the woman who's here because of political pressure." Morrison watched her walk toward the landing zone with the same fluid confidence she had shown all night. He realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare, about training, and about the limits of human capability had been challenged in the space of one night. Sarah Chun wasn't just a female SEAL who had proven she belonged on his team. She was something entirely different, something that made even experienced special operations soldiers look like beginners. As the helicopters touched down and the rescue teams rushed to help the wounded, Morrison made a mental note to have a long conversation with whoever had really been responsible for assigning Sarah to his unit. Because one thing was certain, Lieutenant Sarah Falcon Chun was not the product of any normal military training program. She was something far more dangerous and valuable than that. And after tonight, Morrison knew that he would follow her into any mission, no matter how impossible it seemed. Because impossible was just another word for something Falcon hadn't done yet.